Good morning. Good afternoon, you're right. Are we ready to solve the pension puzzle today? I want to thank you all for being here today to help us discuss one of the state's most pressing issues impacting our state. We hope that this public dialogue and many others over the course of the next few months will help us finally get us closer to solving our pension puzzle. As you know and have read, the BGA has been writing extensively about pensions, and just recently, again for their second op-ed together, we partnered with the Civic Committee of the Commercial Club and the Civic Federation to author our 10 Principles of Pension Reform, which you'll have at your tables. These are the steps that we believe, if followed, would help our elected officials get to a good and solvent place with pension reform. If you did not get a chance to read the op-ed last Sunday, you'll find these and the series that David Greising wrote in your emails this morning. We know that getting this right requires all of us, civic groups, nonprofits, our elected officials, unions, and all to come to the table to do what's right for our state. And we hope to accomplish this sooner rather than later. I'd like to give a warm welcome to a special guest in our audience today, the Speaker of the Illinois House of Representatives, Emanuel Chris Welch. Mr. Speaker, thank you for always keeping the lines of communication open between your office and the BGA, and we thank you for being here today. And I'd also like to thank Blue Room Stream as well for helping us live broadcast this event. Not only are you here, but millions are watching at home, wherever they are, to see us talk about pension reform. And we'll also send a link out to everyone afterwards, too, if you want to watch it again. You all have question slips at your table as well. If at any point you want to hand them in, please raise your hand with the card. And at the end, we're going to try to get to as many questions as possible. But thankfully, many of you have submitted questions throughout the weekend and last week through the email service. And we've actually incorporated those in the discussion today. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome our panel. I would like to welcome BGA President David Greising, Deputy Governor Andy Manar, Senator Robert Martwick, Representative Stephanie Kifowit, and Representative Stephen Reich. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for coming, for making time for this. We heard talk that there's another high-profile event going on in town, and I would just say I appreciate the good judgment you've shown by coming to talk about one of the most important issues facing our city and our state. I appreciate this great panel, people who really know pensions inside and out and have a lot of wisdom to share and also can help us better understand what might be the path forward in terms of fixing really this significant problem. Normally, programs like this don't start with a glossary. Usually the glossary is in the back, but just in case some of you would like a little bit of background on pensions, because we're going to be using terms here that it'd be helpful if you know about it. The pension problem in Illinois dates back, some people think, to 1989 when Governor Jim Thompson signed the law creating a 3% compounded increase in pension benefits every year for state employees for the 5 state pension funds. By 1994, it was evident that this was a real problem, and the legislature passed what's been referred to as the Edgar Ramp, which was a 30-year plan to get us to 90% funding. That remains in effect. At that point, we had $17 billion in pension debt, and we were 52% funded. In other words, we had resources on hand to pay for only about half of the obligations the state had at that point. Payments were kept artificially low for the first 15 years. That meant that the people who voted for this plan didn't have to suffer any political consequences. The rest of us suffered consequences because the underfunding for 15 years, your pension debt really adds up. And the cliff ends in 2045, and then pension payments, the state's pension payments will drop from $18 billion in 2045 to $3.5 billion in 2046. Some people think maybe that's not great planning. A lot of people think before then things will change, new laws will be passed, et cetera. So the Edgar ramp, it became evident it was not getting it done. And so in 2010, the legislature passed a new reform called Tier 2. And you hear a lot of talk about Tier 2, and you'll hear a lot in this discussion. Tier 2 meant that anybody hired beginning January 1st of 2011 received a much smaller retirement benefits. Instead of the 3% compound interest, it was either 3% or half of the consumer price index. The retirement age was moved up to age 67, and the payment was, your benefit payments were figured on the average of the highest of your last 8 years of employment instead of previously your last 4 years of employment. And the salaries were capped the first year at what's called the Social Security wage base. And that's an important note. It's kind of like, that's the pistol in the play that you know somebody's going to pick up and shoot at some point, because we started equal with the Social Security wage base, but we have not remained equal with that, and that has created a problem called the safe harbor problem. Most Illinois employees are not eligible for Social Security, and if you're not eligible for Social Security, there's an IRS rule that requires your employer to offer pension benefits that are equal to Social Security. And in many instances, this is not happening, and there are studies that indicate that that problem is going to get considerably worse over time. Hence, there's a lot of discussion in the legislature right now. We've got some experts on our panel today about how to fix Tier 2. And in fact, Brian mentioned the op-ed that the BGA, the Civic Federation, and the Civic Committee published on Sunday, which was stating our principles of pension reform, which are on the back of your program. And we've agreed on those principles, which is facing the broader pension reform fix that we hope and expect may happen. But we previously had published an op-ed focused on the need for what we call responsible pension reform. I think my mic just went out, but I'll shout. So that's where we are today. It is 2025. There's a lot of talk about problems with Tier 2, and I would just start with a broad question to you all. And Stephanie Kifowit, as chair of the House Pensions Committee, has held, I think, a dozen or more hearings about the various pension problems. As you look at, based on testimony that you've heard, how big a problem is Tier 2 an imminent problem, or is it something that's further down the road and we can take our time addressing it?
Well, thank you, Dave. First, I want to thank the Better Government Association, the Civic Committee, and the Civic Federation for hosting this panel. It is really important to talk about pensions. As Dave said, we held in the House over a dozen, maybe even close to 15 subject matter hearings, because the subject is important, but because when the Tier 2 pension fix went through, it went through in roughly about 48 hours, from presentation to passage to signage. And it's the goal of myself, with the support of the Speaker of the House, who is here, to make sure that we fully vet and fully inform not only this individuals like you and this distinguished audience, but also the public, and get as much robust information as possible to create a policy that's fiscally responsible for the state of Illinois, which is very important. One of your pillars or principles is about our bond rating. We have worked very hard in the House and the Senate and the governor to maintain our bond rating and keep going in the upward trajectory. So any pension solution should not and would not jeopardize that. And then secondly, though, it needs to be responsible and respectful of the employees that work very hard for the state of Illinois. So with that caveat, we've heard lots of testimony with regards to shortages anywhere from teachers to universities to our correctional systems, of individuals that are not only leaving state employment, leaving the teaching profession at about year 8, but going in a totally different direction. They are maintaining their Social Security. They're not putting into the time that we need for the pension, because, as was mentioned, 10 years is the vesting period. When you vest in the state pension system, you lose your Social Security benefits. So we also have extreme shortages in our police and our fire. So testimony we have gotten from superintendents all the way up to department heads is that we cannot attract and retain quality employees with the current pension system we have. And just for reference, Forbes just posted best employee benefits for 2024. What are employees looking for? And 40% of employers say workers leave their job to find a role with better employee benefits. And retirement benefits is the number 3 list of what employees are looking for with regard to employment. And the state of Illinois is simply not competitive when we look at our benefit package to get good quality employees to teach our children, to teach our future engineers and biologists, to ensure that our corrections are safe, our roads are safe, the fire department is fully staffed and safe. So amongst all the other grueling jobs that individuals in the state of Illinois does. For example, I drove into Chicago today. The driving habits of people today are astounding. I am scared as a driver driving on I-88 when I pass the state workers that are fixing holes, that are trimming the brush on the side, that are cleaning, that are doing the maintenance of these roads, that if I fear driving, I just imagine them on the side of the road, our state workers, and how they are feeling about their job when they can't even look to and count on a benefit package that's competitive.
So let me cut in for a second. And Senator Margaret Bob, you have talked in the past about the vacancies among teachers in particular, because the teachers' unions have been the ones who've really been pushing for a pretty ambitious reform of Tier 2. They've even called it what they say undo Tier 2, which basically means take all employees back to Tier 1 levels. We can deal with that question later. But on the question of teachers, I did a little poking around on the interwebs. And there's a study out of Brown University that says that vacancies per 10,000 students in a state, compared all 50 states, vacancies per 10,000 students. Illinois has 11 and a half vacancies per 10,000 students, which puts us in the second quartile of states. Missouri, our neighboring state, has 2.26. They've done really well. Indiana, 16, so well more than us. Iowa, 20, almost double us. Wisconsin and Kentucky, 31. 2 states that have done pension reform. They're notable for it. They've received a lot of attention. I wrote an entire 1,500 words about some of what they have done for the series we published last fall. Arizona is 25 per 10,000, so more than double what Illinois is. Rhode Island has 31,000 per 10,000. So given that data, and I understand the rhetoric, and kind of implicitly we think people might not want to be teachers for some of the reasons Stephanie said, but I'm not sure the data really supports that. States that have serious pension reform, they've got a bigger problem filling teacher slots than Illinois has. And the point of this study that was done out of the Annenberg Center at Brown is there's a big problem just filling these jobs. It's not really pensions, it's all kinds of reasons that these jobs, like Stephanie was talking about, are difficult to fill. So how much will this rhetoric about people's job satisfaction, their willingness to work as state employees, how much will that hold up over time to the closer scrutiny that it inevitably will get?
Well, I mean, I'll be happy to give you my personal
I'm curious,
opinion, but
yeah.
what I would say is that that's a question that I'm being coy here, but maybe the best person to answer that is not the ones on the stage, but the guy sitting over there, right? What effect will those arguments weigh in? Well, that's going to be a question for the entirety of the General Assembly, right? We recognize that at one point, I think the highest level was there were 5,100 unfilled teaching positions in the state of Illinois. We've improved. I think we're down to 3,500 unfilled teaching positions listed on the Illinois State Board of Education website. But I guess as you look at that, you say, well, how important is that? When you compare us to other states, clearly there's a nationwide problem in terms of recruiting and retaining professional educators. But I don't think that the goal is to just sort of say, I think for many members of the General Assembly is like, well, we're not so bad, we're only the second quartile. At 3,500 unfilled classrooms where students file in and there's no teacher, that's going to have an economic cost down the line. Maybe comparatively to other states, it's not as bad, but it's still a problem. Certainly, we have a critical shortages, Representative Kifwit mentioned, of first responders, police officers, very difficult. And I think that, as you mentioned, it's kind of the overall package, but I wouldn't suggest that retirement benefits are not a part of it. While Arizona did do major pension reform, Tier 2 was major pension reform. 67 is the highest retirement age, public sector retirement age in the country. Illinois has that. And that is not something that teachers are not unaware of. There's a story I often talk about just to put it in that individual perspective, right? I have a son who's 8 years old. He is a high needs student. He's a wonderful kid, just beautiful, beautiful kid, and I love him to death. But he has his challenges in a classroom. And so the story I talk about is Miss Schuyler. Miss Schuyler was my son Bobby's preschool special education teacher. And I told my wife at one point that she restored my faith in humanity because of the dedication and devotion that she showed to my child in those difficult circumstances. But Miss Schuyler was 22 right out of college. And I always envisioned her at the age of 27, 5 years into it, coming home on a Friday after a long week, sitting down and pouring a fishbowl full of red wine, sitting down on her couch and going, oh my God, this is tough work.
Yeah.
And for the first time in her young life, she would say, what does the rest of my career look like? And it was then that she would realize that she has to work 4 more decades, 40 years, before she can access a retirement benefit that's roughly equivalent to Social Security. And at that point, Miss Schuyler is going to do exactly what I would do, which is quit and get a job tending bar on a cruise ship, right? No, I mean, it's a real thing.
The big goblet of wine would, work well there.
Well,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
you know,
so-
and I kid, she's wonderful,
Yeah.
and these teachers are, and I think we have to find that, right? And so you say, what effect is this going to have? Well, I believe that we're going to have to convene that table, which is why I refer to my friend, the speaker over here. We're going to have to convene that table, and all of those stakeholders are going to be present. And we're going to have to hear what our valued public sector employees have to say about recruitment and retention, and that's going to have to be part of the equation.
So, again, we're going to focus at first on Tier 2, and then we'll go to statewide reform. There are kind of broadly speaking, sort of three different approaches to Tier 2 reform that have been discussed. One is just simply match the Social Security wage base, because there's now about a $30,000 difference between what you receive in Social Security benefits and what Illinois pension recipients receive on average. That's about right? And there's, let me see, $7 billion. If we match Social Security wage base altogether, it would cost the state, by one estimate, about $7 billion in addition in pension payments between now and 2045. That's the aggregate number, not annually. Annually, I think it's $850 million or something like that. The middle path would be similar to your bill on the Chicago firefighter pension reform, which is increase the final salary calculation, reduce the number of years, and annual benefit increase would be equal to CPI, or which is the city of Chicago, when your bill was going through, Jenny Bennett, the Mayor Lawyer Lightfoot's budget director, said that this would cost the city of Chicago alone $3.3 billion. And so there are concerns about the cost of that fix. The largest talked about is this whole undo Tier 2 movement, which basically says everybody goes back to Tier 1 benefits. And by some estimates, that would add about $82 billion in cost through 2045. In the year 2045 alone, it would add $4 billion on top of that 18 that is already committed. So, Deputy Governor Andy, your boss, our governor, toward the end of session, he had a meeting with reporters in his office, and he said basically that a Social Security wage base fix, he said that's a sweetener, and more or less implied that's where he is drawing the line. Is that where the administration stands? And there clearly will be substantial political pressure to move off of that. Mark, tell us a little bit about what it looks like from the governor's office.
Sure, and David, thanks for the invite. Glad I could be here today to have this discussion. Short answer to your question is yes. That is where the governor's thought process is today. If you go back to February of this year when the governor put his budget proposal on the table to the General Assembly mid-February of 2024 for fiscal year 25, which we're in right now. That was the fourth bucket of what he was proposing. I would note didn't have to, because nothing that he proposed in terms of management of our pension debt would impact the current fiscal year. But he felt responsible to put something forward above and beyond what we have already done as a state in recent years, which is significant. For example, devoting surplus revenues to the tune of $700 million for extra payments into the system. Never been done before in state history, but that's something the governor proposed, the speaker supported, the president of the Senate supported, and members of the General Assembly said, instead of spending this money on other things, we're going to put that down to pay down debt in our pension system. That's good for the state, it's good for our employees, it's good for everyone. So the governor put forward what I would describe as a package of both acknowledgments that we still have work to do, as well as good management practices. So that's currently on the table, and I'd offer my compliments to both the senator and the representative for the work that they've done over the past many, many months to have a public conversation about this, because the governor feels strongly that that public transparency, that piece of this conversation is a must. Looking at veto and lame duck and even the spring of 25, that session. But I want to go back to one thing on recruiting, because I think this is a recruiting of employment.
Sure.
Because this is an important point. We see my two buckets are budget and economy. So I have a perspective of knowing that the state of Illinois, or a school district, or a city, or a park district is an employer just like a private business. So being competitive in the job market is an absolute must for us as a state government to fill critical roles, whether it's in law enforcement at the state police, or whether it's at a 24/7 facility, a veterans home, for example. So what we've done as an administration, which I believe bears out in the data, is success, which is we've netted 3,600 netted, which means we've hired many more new employees in the last fiscal year. And we've been able to do that because budgets have been balanced, because we have been competitive on the wage scale. By the way, this doesn't come without criticism of government, but we have been competitive, which moves us in a different territory than we had been in for years. We offer competitive retirement in many cases, and we also offer an environment that's very different than previous years would offer a potential employee that can go out and get a job pretty much anywhere right now. So we approach this as an administration as an employer. We have to be competitive in all of these things to attract good people to state government. I don't run a school district, but I would imagine that's the same for a teacher. Recruiting a teacher, keeping that teacher in a classroom. But the governor sees this exactly as he described. I think that was at the end of session, David, as you mentioned.
Yes, it was, yeah.
But understands there's a larger conversation that's being spearheaded by the senator and the representative, and we appreciate them involving us in that conversation as it moves
So
forward.
the competitiveness that you're talking about, I'm curious, anybody in the group, is this 22-year-old, then 27-year-old teacher, is the fact that the pension system in Illinois is so deeply underfunded, is that a factor does that affect our competitiveness in terms of being an employer, or does it not? Go ahead, Steve. Yeah.
First of all, thank you for having us here, and regardless of what anybody else is talking about elsewhere in the city, you folks are actually listening to stuff that affect us, because more of what happens to people's lives in this state happens in Springfield than happens in Washington. So regardless of what the dog and pony show elsewhere today is talking about, you guys are getting, hopefully, the kind of information that will lead us to a solution, and I thank you for being here. First of all, Tier 2, the safe harbor. The governor can call it a sweetener if he wishes, but it's a federal requirement, not a state requirement. So regardless of what it's considered or characterized as, this is a federal fix. This is something that's necessary. It's not a state fix. It's not a sweetener. It's a federal requirement. My feeling is that a standalone bill to fix the safe harbor could be done very easily, and the fact is that it's people at the high end of the wage scale who are the ones who are running as most in danger of violating safe harbor, not the people in the general below Social Security wage base earnings. This is something that can be done very easily, but I've been told by many people that if we pass a simple safe harbor fix, that there'll be no appetite to fix anything else. And if that is in fact the case, I'm not very optimistic about what we're going to try to do here. We need to separate the debt from the pensions. We have to consider them separately. We have to figure out how to pay off this debt, and we have to do it in a way that doesn't drive people out of this state and drive businesses and keep businesses from coming in. But we also need to fix or address what is in fact the problem with Tier 2. I think a lot of it has to do with perception. I think the perceptions of Tier 2 are based upon employee sitting next to an employee who's in Tier 1 and saying, I'm doing the same job as this guy, but he's going to be getting much more than what I'm getting when I retire. If you want to go back to Tier 1, I wouldn't have a problem with it if we were to say at the same time, we've got something that will fix the debt here in this state. Now, one thing that's not generally understood is that the Tier 1 pensions are capped at 75% of what it was you were making when you retired or walked off the property. It's the cost of living adjustment and the 3% compounding that is driving our pension debt crazy. It's not the pension itself. If you want to go back to Tier 1 and say that your benefit is going to be based on a certain number of years of service, a factor, final average earnings, and capped at 75% of what you were making when you retired, I don't have a problem with that. And I would be probably I'd be happy to talk to anybody about that. But if we're going back to a Tier 1 system that has all the other stuff that is driving us into bankruptcy, then no, this is not going to work. So we need to separate the debt from the pension, fix and actually sit down and I would rather see every employee in the state of Illinois, teachers, road guys, cops, firemen, all basically within the same structure of a plan, rather than 5 separate plans that everybody has to administer in different ways. Now, I do understand the fact that 67 is, when you're 22 and staring at 67 when you can retire with full benefits, that is a long haul. But Social Security was set up back in the 1930s to help people get transition from work to final reward. But at the time when Social Security was passed, the retirement age was pegged at 65. The average life expectancy in the United States was 67. The average longevity now is we're in our 70s, 80s. But retirement is still pegged at age 65. Well, if we want to set up a pension plan that says, we'll make it worth your while to work a career for the 25, 30, 40 years that it's going to take, hopefully a rewarding career, one that justifies your passion and your commitment to actually doing your job. And we give you a pension at the end of that time that gives you the dignity that you deserve having done that. I'm all in favor of that. But we can't do it in a way that provides the kind of benefits that we're seeing in Tier 1, because we gave away the farm in Tier 1.
So let me jump in there and ask a question of the group. And first of all, I would note the two-tiered wage benefits system we're talking about. This isn't the only industry where there are two tiers of benefits and wages. When you think about the auto industry, for example, as part of the bailout that President Obama oversaw, two-tier wages systems were constructed, and so nobody likes it, but sometimes it becomes necessary. But let me ask a question regarding undue Tier 2. And to the point you're making, Steve, of course, the state just can't afford to go back to Tier 1 for the 50% of employees who currently are on the Tier 2 plan. It would bankrupt the state, presumably. But yet, the rhetoric around it is pretty serious. The two major teachers unions, I think, staged a week or so of demonstrations down in Springfield towards the end of the session. I think you told me you got thousands of emails about this, if I'm not mistaken.
I think we all did.
Yeah, and so perhaps they're overreaching for political effect, but where ultimately is this headed? Stephanie, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm gonna first. I just want to ask for your data with the $7 billion, because we did a lot of work in the House working with COGFA, the Commission on Government and Forecasting Accountability.
Right.
And they said going to the salary cap to Social Security wage base would be about $4.7 billion, not the $7 billion that you're referring
Okay.
to. So I have the report right here.
I'll have to send you my source on that, sorry.
Well, it's right here. So,
Okay, all right, I'll trust COGFA.
but I try to be as thorough as possible as
Thank you.
chair of the pension committee. And then secondly, I realize that there are multiple groups that look at pensions, and one is the Center for Tax Accounting, Budgeting and Accounting, Ralph Martiri. There is a wonderful graph that they have produced that shows the pension benefits, which is a very small yellow line that's relatively flat over the years. That's the benefits. And then they show a very large blue line, which is the unfunded liability. So that data exists when we separate out what is it actually costing us, and it won't bankrupt the state because the actual normal cost is around $3 to $4 billion normally. It's the unfunded liability. It's the fact that the state of Illinois, as was mentioned, decided to take a holiday, decided to not pay our bills. But the interest on that holiday still accrued, kind of like a student loan. It accrues, and we are here today with a large unfunded liability. And in fact, pensions have been issued since 1917. And of course, we can all point to 1971 when they were put into the state constitution with regards to guaranteed benefits. So this isn't a new problem whatsoever. And in the past, there have been words, like you've been mentioned, in the ledger in 1917, insolvency, crisis, 1940s. They warned that there would be, all these words that we are still hearing today. The difference is we have a large unfunded liability from not paying into our pensions. But to be quite clear, in the House, our pension committees were not unions. These were superintendents. These were teachers. These were state workers. These were correctional individuals that said on the record, I'm leaving my job because I don't want to have this pension of working until I'm 67 in corrections on the road. So I just want to put that out there, that this narrative is out here, that it's a big union push. Our House committee listened to the unions, but then spent hours upon hours listening to the workers, listening to the police officers, listening to the firefighters. My own superintendent of Wabansie High School said, I want to testify. I want to testify at your committee, Rep, because I can't get teachers. And one of the big things why I can't get teachers is because of the retirement plan of the state of Illinois. So regardless of what plan comes out that's agreed upon, that's fiscally responsible for the state, number one, and equally respectful of the job that our employees do, we need to acknowledge that it needs to be fixed. When my own superintendent of the high school in my district wants to testify about the teacher shortage in his school district and how the number one reason he's hearing in his hiring is because of the pension system. So I disagree that going to tier one will bankrupt. I disagree with that statement.
Okay.
There are models, there are numbers out there. We have a lot of COGFA figures out there. We've been looking through the committee at all the financial implications, and there will be. But that's why this is why it's taking some time to make sure it's fiscally responsible and respectful for the employees.
You're pointing at me, Steve, and I'm sort of pointing at you, so you go first, but yeah, go ahead.
Well, first of all, I think you remember back, and first of all, Stephanie and I worked together very well on the pension committee. I don't think there's a hell of a lot that we disagree on from a theoretical or a standpoint of what we want to accomplish. So to that, she deserves a lot of credit for including me in those conversations, because it could very well be otherwise. Perception. When you were down in Springfield a couple months ago and you testified, I pointed out to you the fact that you're the guys with the megaphones. You're the ones who should have things like this, where it's where we can sit and explain what it is that we're confronting here. The perception is part of the problem. It's a big part of the problem. And we did a little. My staffer Jacob back there, who's sitting here, he did a comparison of there are some still defined benefit plans here in Illinois. Caterpillar, Ameren, the Plumbers Union. And those folks are getting a pension and combined with coordinated with Social Security. They get their Social Security as well. I'll give you a few for instances. Caterpillar's pension, and these are based on people making $75,000 a year working to full vesting and things like that. We won't get into the vesting rules and all that stuff. The pension for a person making $75,000 a year at Caterpillar to full vesting is $2,800 a month. Social Security, roughly $2,650 for about $5,500 a month. Ameren, $2,077. $2,647 in Social Security, $4,700 a month. The Plumbers Union, close to $4,000 a month in pension, $2,647 Social Security, $6,500. But if you go to the state employee retirement system, $4,125 a month for full vesting, at full vesting. The alternative plan under the state employee retirement system, uncoordinated with Social Security, $5,250 a month. State University Retirement System, $4,125. Judges, $3,750, and
so your point is that that's their sole pension benefit,
whereas
the others have a benefit.
But the fact is that compare those rough figures and within a range to what Tier 1 employees who are retired are getting with that unreconstructed COLA, 3% compounding every year. When Speaker Madigan retired, he retired at an average wage of assumed about $100,000 a year. His first pension payment was $161,000 a year. There's your problem, folks.
So you mentioned, Steve, your view that, and I'm pivoting now toward discussion of the statewide pension reform that also is being talked about, and there are some very interesting plans on the table. You said you think that Tier 2 alone, if Tier 2 alone were, a fix were to pass, that would be the end of pension reform.
No, safe harbor.
I'm sorry, safe harbor fix alone would pass. Is it the view of people around the table, anybody can answer, that either the governor's plan or the civic committee plan or CTBA has their own plan, Ralph Martiri's group, is it your view that a Tier 2 fix and broader pension reform need to happen together, or the latter doesn't happen? Or do you think that the two of them could pass independently? We could see Tier 2 perhaps done first and then eventually get around to one of the other more sweeping reform plans.
If I can take this one, I would say that, with all due respect to my colleagues, I've probably been working on this issue longer than most people here. And what I would say is that I'm always an eternal optimist. So I always come to Springfield thinking, this is the year we're going to do something big. And it's hard. Pensions are one of those subject matters that they're not, it's not early childhood education or intervention, right? Those are fun issues that people get really excited about: energy policy, healthcare policy. Pensions are incredibly important. As Steve said, most of our problems can be traced back to our inability to have the resources to solve our problems, and yet getting people to coalesce around a solution is monumentally difficult, it would appear. So I think that there is value in trying to package something and address as many things as possible. There's no doubt, as long as we have, the whole idea of the General Assembly is that we show up every year and we try and fix problems, right? So there's no doubt that if we pass something that we'll be able to cobble stuff together. But I think for the purposes of everybody at the table, it's better to have the certainty of trying to address as many problems as possible at once. I just think that would be the best path forward, and it's what I've always advocated for.
Go ahead.
Yeah, David, I was going to just throw out a couple of more ideas that I think might get broad consensus. Although that, I'm not in the legislature anymore, so I would defer to my
your way around the
colleagues
halls there, though. Yeah.
But going from 90% to 100%, I think that could receive broad consensus among both parties, House and Senate. I think reinvesting money that we're using today to pay off pension bonds, when those debts retire, taking that money that's now being used to pay off debt and reinvesting it into the systems, like make that decision today that we're going to do that in 2030 and 2033 when those bonds retire. Making that policy choice today is something that we ought to do as a state. And then the other piece that has been talked about and other states do is understanding that the cliff in 2045, managing that cliff, because there's less room ahead of us than behind us from the Edgar ramp at this point. So we can see the end of the line. It's a ways away, but we can see it. And managing our way through that so there's not an abrupt shift, a dramatic shift in the system. Doing that proactively is something that I think we can have consensus on. So that's the governor's proposal, by the way. Those things plus safe harbor. And that we think is a credit positive for the state, which is an important piece of, on the governor's to-do list is we need more credit upgrades. Makes a big difference for us as a state, both in perception and in terms of financial management. So those four things are what the governor put on the table in February. We think that's a credit positive, and we think we can further manage our pension debt in the state and our outlook with pensions and get a credit upgrade at the same time.
Great. Thank you. And I did recognize some of the characteristics of the governor's plan there. So thank you for that. That pretty much you laid it out. The Civic Committee plan, which is the other prominent plan, the CTBA plan has us going down to 80% funding, which would be very damaging to the state's credit rating, and therefore it's not getting a lot of pickup. So we're not going to really discuss that plan. The Civic Committee plan would also achieve 100% funding by 2053. The catch is there would be a 0.5% in tax surcharge on individuals, 0.7% on corporations, and that money would be dedicated through some kind of a lockbox to protect it to going and any other use would be dedicated entirely towards pensions. That would be for 10 years, that tax surcharge. Altogether, $28.5 billion in new taxes they would expect. They expect that they would save $37 billion by 2045 or later, depending on when it passes, over 22 years. The governor's plan, and please correct me if I'm wrong, since Stephanie's maybe will call me if I am, I think his plan saves about $5 billion. So the Civic Committee plan is kind of tougher medicine up front, but it has immediate effect, and probably, based on pension experts I've talked to, would say that sort of exit velocity one would achieve by having that big upfront money right away instead of waiting till 2030. They see that as a big advantage. I'm curious, thoughts about comparatively those two plans, any thoughts?
First of all, the one thing, front loading is always a good idea. Ralph Martiri's plan would front load it and then thus.
With the sale of pension bonds.
Yeah, right, which
Yeah.
would transfer the risk of default from the plan itself to the bondholders. And I don't think the governor would be crazy about that either.
No, because we feel, we could say this today, that would be a credit downgrade for the city.
Absolutely.
And that's something that the governor isn't interested in.
No, and if there's one thing I will give Governor Pritzker credit for is his slavish adherence to trying to keep our credit rating up. He deserves a lot of credit for that.
And he's had some considerable success in that regard as well.
I
Right.
props to him. The one thing I'm not seeing from any of these plans is the people who are getting the benefits. You know, we're saying we're all in this together. We all have to, let's all pull our oars in the same direction and all that kind of stuff. Everybody's got to have some skin in the game. Nobody's talking about the possibility of some sort of payback from the people who are receiving these pensions. And I'm going to throw this out. I'm probably going to get some. Is there cake out there that's going to get thrown at me? But
No,
I'm
it looks
willing,
like a
if we're going to go to the
pudding.
taxpayers, if we're going to go to the taxpayers and say, hey, you got to pony up all this money for 10 years. I don't think it's unfair to take and tell the people who are receiving state pensions that for the next 10 years, the pension you receive from the state of Illinois, whether it's TRS or SERS or anybody else, the pension you receive from the state of Illinois is going to be subject to state income tax. Social Security is not taxable in this state. You know, nobody who's on retirement pays state income tax. But the fact is that pensions, especially Tier 1, I'm gonna beat up on Tier 1 people. But the fact is that nobody's paying state income tax on this stuff. If we can adjust the tax code to say, if you're getting a state pension, we're not going to, if you're getting Social Security from another job or something like that, no, that remains non-taxable. If you're getting a private pension and a state pension, that private pension remains untaxable. That's fine. But the fact is that if you're going to ask for something from the taxpayers of Illinois, you are also going to have to be a taxpayer of Illinois.
Yeah, I'm not a lawyer, but we have at least two lawyers on the panel.
I'm a lawyer as well.
Right, I know. Would that, if you taxed pension benefits, might that not run into a challenge on a constitutional
You're
basis?
getting your same
That
pension. Your
diminishes-
benefits are not being diminished.
It
No.
would diminish your pension benefit if you have
No,
to do something
you're
like that.
getting your
No?
full pension benefit. You're
Okay.
just putting it on a tax
What do you
return
think,
and throwing
Tom?
some money at it.
Well, we're not considering that, texting retirement.
Okay, so what's the
Yeah.
sense in us
Yeah,
being here if
that's,
we're not,
I mean, this is, my colleague, my esteemed vice chair of pensions, we do agree, as he said, a lot and disagree on a few things. This is one of the things that I think we disagree on. In part, as I mentioned, CDBA, just because they have a great chart. The problem is not the benefits that our Tier 1 pensioners are receiving. The problem is the unfunded liability. So to treat state employee pensioners differently than other seniors that have been retired, to me, is a bit discriminatory, because Those pensioners put in the time, they worked 35 years, 40 years for a pension benefit that they were promised. And the state now needs to look at and understand how are we gonna, look at all the data. And there are many different plans. There are many different, as you mentioned, many different solutions. This is why government does not run quickly or haphazardly, like the tier 2, as my esteemed senator, former colleague, because Rob was in the House, would say. He spent a lot of time fixing some of the issues with tier 2 because it was done so quickly. Right. And in the House, under the leadership of Speaker Welch, we're not going to do things quickly. We're going to do things thoroughly, respectfully, fiscally responsibly, and make sure that we get the job done. So I'm at a difference of opinion with my esteemed colleague.
And let me ask you, Steve, the governor has let it be known that whatever pension reform passes, he would like to see a bipartisan bill. I don't know if that view has changed at all. Andy can tell us or not as he chooses. But are you implying that in order to get Republican votes, something like what you just described might be necessary, especially if there is a tax surcharge, let's say?
Yeah, the people who are receiving the pension have got to come to the table with something more than just their hat in their hand. You've got to do something to help solve the problem instead of add to it. The simple fact is that the taxpayers of Illinois, everybody sitting out here who is not retired, is going to be paying on that surcharge. But there's going to be absolutely no demand upon the people who actually, Stephanie may say, okay, well, they did their job, they worked, You don't get what you deserve, you get what you negotiate. And what we have in this state is a very big problem with people on both sides of the table negotiating with themselves. Let's face this.
So this is...
Rates of return were not accurately calculated in many cases. We've got a ramp that deals with statutory rather than actuarial contributions to the plan. Our funding ratios aren't going up. I was trying to find it online here. Our funding ratios of our 5 state plans aren't increasing at a rate that will get us to 90% by 2045. We're 20 years away from that, and we are looking at least 2 or 3 economic downturns. And every time we have an economic downturn, those funding ratios go down because you've got benefits going like this. You've got funding trying to keep up, and then we have a downturn, 2008, boom. Then we've got a funding ratio down here, and we're starting to work our way back up. We're never going to get there. I don't have a problem with front-loading a lot of this stuff, but it's got to be done sensibly. It's got to be an all-hands-on-deck type of enterprise, and I don't see anything wrong. And I would be much more inclined as a Republican to go to my caucus and say, okay, this is something that needs to be done. We all understand that. We're not whistling past anybody's graveyard here. We understand the need for that. And it would be a heck of a lot more palatable to my caucus if I was to go to them and say, well, we're putting some of the onus on the people who actually are the beneficiaries of this unsustainable debt.
So clearly, we have supermajorities in both houses of the legislature, and so the Republican votes are not needed to pass a law.
No.
But nevertheless, bipartisanship is generally perceived as being good. Is there room for discussion here? The Democrats, are you hearing that thinking, yeah, we've got something to talk about here, or are you willing to move a bill forward without one that won't get any Republican support?
I can't speak to that, of course. Ultimately, that is going to be a decision of our leadership, and I mean the governor, the speaker, and the Senate president on how they want to structure those roll calls. What I would say is this discussion kind of shows right what I was talking about, the challenge of you're talking about 4 people that are really interested in this issue, and you have a hard time getting us on the same page. Imagine 177 legislators who don't have that full thing, right? It's difficult. And so one of the ways that I've talked to my leadership about solving this is sort of like you solve a puzzle, right? I mean,
Hence the pension puzzle. Go ahead.
yes,
Sorry to
yes.
interrupt.
Thank you.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
a good analogy. Is you have to, you can't put the puzzle together unless you're sure you have all the pieces, right? And so a lot of it is identifying the pieces, getting the stakeholders at the table, and solving this. There are so many different things here, but like right off the top of the list, aiming for 100% funding, which is absolutely the right thing to do. But as I often point out, even that is rife with problems. Because all you have to do is you have to look at policies that have been put in place in the past that took funds that were more than 100% funded and put them at nearly insolvent status, because 100% can be false, right? Steve mentioned the market downturn. What happens usually when there's a prolonged market downturn? Then all of a sudden, all the actuarials come out and they say, oh, well, we aim too high, let's change the actuarial assumptions. And suddenly, the change in the two factors, the loss of the returns and the change of the assumptions, they exacerbate your downturn, right?
Right.
And so, should we be aiming for 100? Absolutely. Should we be aiming for 90? No. But could we potentially put in guardrails that allow us to keep funding even once we've hit 100, because 100 can be false.
Right.
In the great historical example is City of Chicago, the Chicago Teacher Pension Fund in 1994 was 107% funded. And the first act of the mayoral controlled school board under then CEO Paul Vallis was to skip 7 consecutive pension payments, which was carried on by the next CEO for another 3 years. So a decade of skipped pension payments. And because what they said was, as long as it was 90% funded,
Right.
we didn't need to make a payment. But 90 was false because the market was propping it up and actuarial assumptions were propping it up, and then went from 90 to 43 within a matter of 3 years.
So let me cut in there, since you brought up puzzles.
Sure.
Everybody who does a jigsaw puzzle knows you start with the border, right? And we, the BGA, the Civic Federation, the Civic Committee, we got together and drew on what we have to offer in terms of expertise and came up with what we hope might be the border for serious discussion of pension reform. That activity that takes place within the border of the 10 principles that we put together, if those principles are followed, we'll come away with a decent looking puzzle at the end of the day when all the pieces that you talk about are in place. And so everybody has this on the back of your program. The 10 points are achieve and maintain 100% funding. Sounds like you're not in total agreement with that. Improve Illinois credit rating. I would think everybody could sign on to that. Maximize long-term savings. Is that reasonable in the view of this group?
Well, as Deputy Governor said, putting more money, the $700 million in multiple budget years, does save us money. It
Right.
is maximizing our savings. So the more we address the long-term debt, the more savings will be had. So conceptually, that's not against what we're trying to do here.
Okay. So within the context, because the Civic Committee plan saves a lot more, but within the context of what that plan accomplishes,
Right.
that would be, you could view that
That's
as
one of the
maximizing
goals,
it.
is to get down our debt so that we have savings.
Ensure and protect dedicated funding. You've got the bond, the money that otherwise would have gone bonds going to the program. The Civic Committee has this tax surcharge, but you don't want that money to go pay for something else, right? I don't know if that's in the governor's plan, some sort of lockbox protection. Eliminate the pension cliff at 2045, 2046 that I talked about. Is that a net good? Everybody's in agreement there. Responsibly address the tier 2 salary cap issue. I think we've discussed that. Prioritize intergenerational equity. Talk about that a little bit.
What's the old saying? Sometimes even a blind squirrel finds a nut. When the governor was first elected in 2019, he had a very bright young man who now works for a pension fund by the name of Cameron Mock. And Cameron, he loved pensions, and we would sit around and talk about them. And one day, I sketched on the back of a piece of scratch paper, I sketched out this peak and cliff we talk about, and then I overlaid it with a mound, right? And I said, wouldn't it be more predictable to pay it back that way? And he said, and he kind of smiled and said that, there's some other people he knew had talked about that as well. And I said, yeah, and I said, it's like if you do 3 generations, one generation created the problem by underfunding the pension systems. One generation was required to pay it back by a lack of government services and high taxes, educational resources cut dramatically, higher ed cut dramatically. So our families and our kids had to pay more and get less services out of it. And so, as you mentioned, with the change in the funding, so the next generation could live like drunken sailors and get a tax cut, right? And I said, it's not fair. I said, we need some intergenerational equity, the term you used.
Right, right.
And I'm not looking to pat myself on the back on it, but like I said, sometimes the blind squirrel finds a nut. I think it's critically important that we do that because of the way I laid it out. I have young kids, and what I see in terms of the biggest problem with the pension problem is that what we were left with, none of us created that. We all have to solve this problem, and step up to solve it we will. But in the meantime, my kids, when I send $1 to the Chicago Public Schools, don't get $1 worth of resources out of that. I have to pay back that debt that was created by the irresponsible policies of the past. So it's important to me, when I look at this, I want a solution that we will actually hit, unlike the solutions that have been proposed in the past, which seem to be like, as you say, the can kick. It's only going to make it worse later,
Right.
but we don't have to solve it, right?
Right.
No, I want something that we are going to agree on that will get this done once and for all, that will put guardrails in to make sure it doesn't happen. And again, we'll spread out some of the burden of paying it back. I don't want my kids to have to pay it back, but I also don't want them to have to suffer the whole cost of this, right? It's got to be, there has to be some spread of this burden because it's too large for just one generation to have to pay it back.
Great, thank you. Let's keep going through the list. Promote transparency and predictability. And Stephanie, you talked about the damage that was done by just 48 hours adoption of Tier 2. Policy proposals should focus on pension solutions. We all know that if this were to come, say, at the end of the session, you have a Christmas tree bill, it has unintended effects. I don't know if it's realistic to think that a pension reform would pass cleanly without much else attached to it. Anybody who's been around have a view on that?
If you look at the Civic Committee proposal here, they're including incremental funding of the Budget Stabilization Fund, which, you know, I got no problems with us putting money away for a rainy day, but we should not be putting money away for a rainy day when it's pouring rain outside right now. And part of what we need to do is focus on that. And part of also, if I believe, is part of this, is to take some of the savings and put them into other programs. You don't run up a $100,000 credit card debt and then go out and buy a new car on credit. You try to pay down the $100,000 credit card debt before you do anything like that. And anything that we can do, and again, it goes back to what I said, the plans themselves need to be considered and maybe adjusted and things like that. But we need to separate the debt from that, and we have to fix the debt as a separate thing. We can't make the debt part of the solution to our sustainable pension plans. That brings up part of the intergenerational thing, because if you're coming in as a teacher at 22 and you're looking at a pension, 30 years down the road, you also don't want to be paying down that debt. You want to have that dealt with in some other way. And if we can find a way to do that, and it's not just the 5 state plans, which we're talking about today, it's all the other plans that are, the City of Chicago, the Chicago Teachers Pension Fund, the Park District Fund, and all those others that have got the same problem, if not worse. But the fact is that we've got to separate the pension and what a pension provides from the debt that we have allowed to accumulate. Because if we try to do both under the same piece of legislation, it just isn't going to work.
So Rob's responding to some of what you just said.
Yeah, and I mean, the underlying question was about a Christmas tree bill, and
Right.
I love Steve. We've had a good relationship for a long time since I was in the House. I'm going to differ with him just a little bit here, and only for clarification purposes. The analogy you made was you got a car loan and buying a new car. That's not really what we do, despite what you might think in Springfield. For instance, I'll show you one of our new programs was we dedicated $12 million for creating access to mental health for first responders. We have a catastrophically high suicide rate amongst police officers in the city of Chicago. We felt we needed to provide mental health resources for them. And so I get it, spending is tricky because but we're not buying new cars. These are responding to the needs of our communities that are brought to us. And so those are difficult decisions. But I want to say this, in terms of Christmas tree, I think that what you're going to see with a pension bill when we're able to bring it together, it will be pensions. I don't think it will be crowded full of other things, but I think it will be focused to pensions.
So let's keep
However,
it on.
there are other things in there that are being asked for in terms of fixes that again, this is that puzzle piece. Where will that wind up in this negotiations?
Let me put a finer
And
point on that.
one of the things, Dave's in the House is if you notice, there are a lot of pension bills that I filed because we need to flush out and we have to have COG to analyze and look at all the different factions, all the different proposals that are being asked for with regards to pensions. So it's going to be multifaceted, but I don't see it as being a willy-nilly Christmas tree where at the end of the day everybody's putting in their nugget for their community, for their special project. So
let's keep it
we're going to
focused.
focus it on pensions.
Yeah, but even
how
with
many
the-
layers and how many different dynamics of that bill remains to be seen.
Right, even within pensions, you could have people saying, hey, there's a bunch of municipal pension funds across the state that are deeply underfunded. Let's go after that too. We've had some discussion of folding the Chicago Teachers Pension Fund into TRS. I mean, are those ideas, are you as leaders, thought leaders on these issues, are you all showing them the hand on that kind of talk, or is that
Well,
possibly going to work its way into the discussion?
With all deference to the center, first and foremost, there are issues with different pension plans. So do I envision a Social Security wage-based only bill? No. Do I envision looking at a comprehensive, responsible pension plan that meets and really addresses the need of the state of Illinois in a fiscally responsible manner, but also addresses some concerns with regards to pensions in other areas, quite possibly, because we need to make sure that we do it right the first time, and we address the needs so that, unlike my fellow senator, former rep, we don't want to go back and do fix after fix after fix after fix after fix again. So that is why this is slow, it's deliberate. You want to call it a Christmas tree, I call it getting it done right the first time, and not having to go back and make all these, and to be quite honest, as Representative Reich says, I function in a bipartisan manner. I am always talking to them, always informing them, bringing them in the room. I function in a bipartisan manner. So in the House, we are trying very hard to work together.
What does this look like from the governor's office, this question of just what's most passable from your perspective?
Well, we're not the experts on what's
Right,
possible.
right.
But when I hear Christmas tree, that term, that for me is like an echo of the past.
Right.
And I don't think that is something that I just don't think is going to happen, because embedded in the echoes of the past is fiscal irresponsibility. And judging from the work that has been done thus far, I don't see any piece of evidence that would lead anybody to believe that's what's going to happen here.
Right.
But I should be very clear, the governor doesn't support anything that is fiscally irresponsible, that is going to harm our credit rating, that is going to send us down a different road than we're on today. We've paid down all of our bills. We had $17 billion of unpaid bills a few years ago. Right, we've paid those down. We've put extra money into the pension systems. We've had 9 credit upgrades. We've had how many balanced budgets? 6 in a row now. That's the path we're on, and it took a lot to get there. And I don't see anything in this conversation that is going to be a threat to that.
So with the addition of, say, let's deal with some of the municipal pension funds across the state, or
Well,
TRS?
I mean, I will make this comment about CTPF. Just everyone should understand that Chicago Teachers Pension Fund is intertwined in the evidence-based funding model, unlike every other TRS, which supplies the structure and the benefit for every other teacher in every other school district in the state. I mean, we could have a whole nother debate about that, but it is unique. But I would just be, and I know a little bit of something about EBF, so I would be very cautious about going into that conversation without fully understanding what impact that has on evidence-based funding, because I can't imagine, given all the success that the state has had since 2017, since that landmark piece of legislation was signed into law, and all of the good that is happening and stable funding that's happening for school districts around the state, that anyone would want to inadvertently, pull a foundational piece of EBF out of the construct of how it works. And that could very well happen. So I'm not saying it's impossible, but I would just be very cautious about going into that conversation without an understanding of what really is being talked about when CTPF comes into the fold.
That's a good point.
Thank you. That's a great point and very interesting and important one. And you're right, we could spend another 20 minutes, but we won't. Real quick, we incorporated some of the questions that came in over the internet. There's one of our people in the audience, Chris Noon, had sent a note talking about the impact that the pension issue has on our state and its reputation. I'm going to wrap it here. And economic development in the state. He's focused in particular on company relocation decisions, but there are other factors such as the population loss that we've had in recent years.
We haven't had population loss.
We have not.
No, we have not.
Not in the last couple of years, but over the last 10 years?
There has never been more people living in the state of Illinois than there is today.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So I want to.
Sorry, I've been
I haven't
reading
jumped
too
in
many
yet on anything
IPI
here, but
editorials. Yeah.
If you census, the census is the census. There's a thing called the post-enumeration survey that
Okay.
shows that Illinois gained population. It's a correction.
Okay, right.
And it's a real correction from the Census Bureau. So I just want to dispel that right
Okay.
away. Illinois is not losing people. Illinois is gaining people.
So to what extent is this an issue either in terms of our standing nationally or globally? Or what do you hear, if anything, from your constituents about the pension problem per se? How live an issue is this in the world? Because we're all pension wonks here. Everybody here must be pension wonks, or you would have gone and seen somebody else somewhere else in the city today. How big a deal is this really?
Well, I'll speak from the business development perspective, if that's helpful.
Yeah.
So it is an issue. Perception is reality. And that's twofold. It's from companies that are seeking to make major investments and locate those investments somewhere. So we have the perception of Illinois and its finances to deal with there. And then we also have perception for businesses that are here, that know the state well, that understand its challenges, that have lived through some pretty rotten years in the last decade when it comes to state finances. So part of what the governor does, he does this every day, is have conversations with CEOs within and outside of Illinois about the change that we've had. And I think 4 years ago, the case could easily be made that we are turning the page and that things are much better than they used to be. But now there's a pattern of disciplined budget decision making happening in Springfield between the governor and the General Assembly. So that's a tough thing to undo overnight. Matter of fact, it's impossible to do overnight, but it's a tough thing that can be done. So that's very much on the governor's mind in this conversation, is we can't threaten that perception and the momentum that we have undoing what many would say is a couple decades of some recurring bad news when it comes to state finances.
So all of which mitigates, mitigate's not the right word. It drives us toward the question of when might pension reform happen? This may be my last question. I'm just to the group. I'm curious. There's some discussion that maybe pension reform would happen in the veto or lame duck session. That doesn't look likely based on conversations I've been having. Please correct me if I'm wrong. Will pension reform happen possibly by the end of the spring session?
Well, I think one of the number one pressing issues, as you mentioned, was the Social Security wage base. We currently now have retirees that are in violation of the Social Security wage base provision, and next year there's going to be more, and next year there's going to be more. Testimony in committee, if we fail Social Security wage base, if we get sued, and we have to put everybody into Social Security, not only do we have to pay in arrears to Social Security, but then we have a mandatory Social Security payment in addition to our pension payment. It's going to be at least 12 to 15% higher than the $10 billion we're paying today. So that is not an option when we're talking about being a fiscally responsible, in my book, having a fiscally responsible solution. So this solution has to happen relatively quickly. I don't have a crystal ball. Things in Springfield, have to materialize, have to work together. But the fact of the matter is, and the testimony in the House that we've had, is that we are already, with a handful of employees, violating the Social Security provision, and that is going to rapidly grow bigger and bigger and bigger as the years progress.
Isn't the bigger question if it, as a system, it violates the provision, or is it, I guess an individual would have a
An
cause of
individual
action,
has
right?
standing to sue.
Right, okay.
Because they are in, as my esteemed colleague said, it's a federal issue. And so it just needs to be
So you're saying action should happen this spring, it sounds like, maybe sooner. And then going back to something that was said earlier, should that pass as a standalone, or will there be an effort to package things together and move the governor's bill, move the civic committee plan?
Safe harbor needs to be solved separately. There's no question about that, because, again, if we violate safe harbor, we haven't gotten guidance from the IRS except for the fact of what a violation of safe harbor looks like. We haven't gotten guidance from the IRS as to what will happen if we do start falling into noncompliance with safe harbor. The one thing that is out there is the fact that this is not going to fall on the state. This cost of turning everybody into Social Security is not going to fall to the state. You're going to see school boards being told to bring people into the Social Security system. Your real estate taxes are going to go straight to Mars, because the high, the high salaries that are now bringing us into noncompliance with safe harbor to a great extent reside there. So if what we do is we ignore this problem and require it to be part of some, it's the bell cow for some larger thing, we're never going to get there. We need to get this thing off the table, solved, and it's a simple fix of making the Social Security wage base eligible, everybody, making up to the Social Security wage base. Boom.
So going back,
Then we can go and start talking about the plans and all the other benefits and all the other things and how we package compensation plans to bring in good employees and keep them. But until we fix that,
will we lose momentum or gain momentum for more sweeping pension reform if Social Security gets fixed and, people
You mean
can
safe
declare
harbor?
victory?
I'm such a terrible prognosticator, I couldn't tell you. I would just say that, I think there is some sense of urgency in the General Assembly that I have not seen in the 8 years that I've worked on pensions. And I think that now, whether we will or we won't, again, that's a leadership decision. I know that people on this dais here are ready and able to get to work on it, but that's going to require our leadership to set the table, bring the parties to the table, and work out a package. It's going to be a challenging calendar. I've mentioned this to people. It's like, we can get it done. There's an election in November. Okay, so after the election, we'll know, then we'll be at veto, and you can't really do it while you're there. So we'll get past veto, and then we'll start working on it. Oh, wait, that next week is Thanksgiving, and then it's Thanksgiving to Christmas, and we could work on it after Christmas before New Year's, but we're supposed to be back in lame duck in early January. So there's not a lot of time, less time than even the calendar would show. But again, I think there is a sense of urgency amongst the General Assembly that we need to get something done. I myself, as I stated, I'll just say it again, I prefer the comprehensive. I know we're running out of time, and I said I was going to do this, so I'm going to do it now. I'm going to point out the 800-pound gorilla in the room, and that is as bad as the system might be, as we talk about it in the state system, the city of Chicago is exponentially worse, literally on the edge of insolvency. And if we don't do something with the city of Chicago, as Chicago goes, so will go the state. We all sit here in the room, but if Chicago enters fiscal insolvency in the city of Chicago, because our pension systems, they're at near bankrupt levels.
Right.
I think we need to be looking at that as part of the solution. I don't know how you leave them hanging out there unaddressed. They are creations of the state legislature, and it's going to take legislative solutions to help solve their problems as well.
Okay.
Right, and we've always operated in a comprehensive view. As I'd mentioned, the superintendent of Waubonsie Valley High School, he needs teachers. He needs to keep his teachers. This can't keep dragging on. So I think comprehensive is overall the best for the state in a fiscally responsible manner. We have discussed in our committees Chicago Teacher Pension Fund, Chicago Funds, Cook County Pension Systems. They had a plan to shore up their plans that we worked with. So again, it needs, in my opinion, it needs to be comprehensive in nature, thorough in nature, fiscally responsible in nature, and respectful of the employee as well.
All right. With that, we'll thank you for a really robust discussion. Thank you all for coming with your own materials. I was really impressed and a little scared of Stephanie.
I was in the Marines, so.
Thank you all for your attendance and attention to this important issue, and we'll be watching, and BGA's policy team is on the job along with the Civic Committee, the Civic Federation, to be helpful in whatever way we can. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.